There are nights in Red Hollow that seem never-ending. The silence weighs like a shroud, and even the desert seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to rise from the darkness. That night the streets were still, too still, and my footsteps echoed alone down the main alley. The sound of my boots was the only sign that anyone was still alive in that cursed town. And then I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The desert was silent still. Then the sound came again, drawn out, deep, metallic. A whistle, not the whistle of a man, nor the call of an animal. It was the whistle of a train. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if invisible fingers had touched me. The Red Hollow tracks had been dead for years. The rusted iron lay beneath the sand, like the bones of a forgotten giant. No locomotive had crossed that desert since before the curse, since before I became sheriff. Still, the whistle echoed in the heavy air like a call from far beyond the dunes. With each blow, I also heard the creak of wheels against iron, a sound that shouldn't exist. There were no trains arriving or departing, but there it was, advancing through the night as if plucked from the past or from hell. The whistle lingered, carrying with it a lament. It wasn't just the sound of a machine, it was the cry of someone carrying something with them, something that shouldn't be seen, not in that instant. I realized that the silence of Red Hollow had been broken by an intruder. But this was no intruder of flesh and blood. That train no longer belonged to the world of men. It was coming from somewhere else, traversing paths no one else dared tread. And when I heard it, I knew it wasn't calling out to ordinary passengers. It was calling out to me. In that instant, I realized it wasn't just the sound of a train lost in time. It was a calling. And when the desert calls, someone always has to pay the price. Stay with me, because whatever was coming down the Red Hollow tracks wasn't bringing passengers. It was bringing curses. The whistle sounded again, closer, deeper, as if the iron of the tracks itself was screaming in the desert. It wasn't just a sound. It was a warning. The air vibrated, and for a moment I felt as if the sand on the ground moved, as if breathing along with that metallic call. I headed toward the old Red Hollow station, a skeleton of wood and rust that had long since ceased to receive travelers. With each step, the sound of the imaginary wheels grew clearer, the metallic creak, the friction against tracks I knew no longer supported anything. My eyes scanned the darkness, searching for signs of life. But there was nothing. No knights, no travelers, no souls brave enough to approach this place. Only me, bearing the curse that bound me to the burden of watching over the dead. And maybe that was why I could hear it. Maybe no one else could. The wind, which until then had refused to blow, stirred up a fine dust, and the sickly moon illuminated the station's old signs. They creaked as if waking from a sleep too long. The whistle echoed again, this time so close it seemed to come from within my own chest. The sound seeped into my bones, vibrated in my sheriff's star, as if mocking the weight I carried. And then I saw it. First, as a figure in the distance. Then, its metallic outlines emerging from the dust. A locomotive was moving forward, covered in rust and shadows. The car windows reflected the moonlight, but there was no movement inside. No passengers. Number, conductor. Just a train that shouldn't exist, gliding smoothly toward the dead station. I knew Red Hollow held buried secrets. But that night, I realized some secrets don't stay underground. Some return, crossing forgotten trails, bringing with them echoes of something the desert insists on returning. And as the whistle blared in the void, I understood I wasn't there to witness an arrival. I was about to witness a return. The silence of the station was swallowed by the approaching metallic sounds. The wheels creaked, the air filled with a ghostly hiss, and soon the locomotive emerged from the desert, cutting through the darkness like a hungry iron beast. But there was no fire coming from the chimney, no smoke, no burning coal. It was as if the train breathed on its own, driven by something not of this world. Dust swirled as the locomotive pulled to a stop in front of the old station. I felt the impact in my bones, as if the ground had shaken beneath my feet. The screech of the brakes echoed so loud it sounded like a plea, but no driver was in sight in the cab. It was empty. The worn seat, covered in rust and dust, looked as if it hadn't been used by human hands in decades. I slowly climbed the iron stairs, my fingers touching the handrail, cold as ice, buried beneath the sand. The wood of the train car groaned under my weight, and I immediately realized I was not alone. The air had a strange density, as if invisible bodies occupied the benches. The leather seats were marked by recent dents, as if passengers had been sitting there, but without visible form. The smell was a mixture of scrap metal, ancient dust, and wilted flowers, the typical odor of cemeteries, not trains. I walked through the first car. My every step echoed too loudly, as if mocking the silence. The windows misted inside, reflected, distorted reflections back at me. Sometimes it was my face, sometimes something that looked like mine, but with sunken eyes and paler skin. The oil lamps hanging from the ceiling flickered on and off without flames, illuminating figures that disappeared when I stared. I moved on to the second car. The doors closed behind me with a bang, as if the train itself refused to let me out. The narrow corridor stretched longer than it should have, and for a moment I thought I would never reach the end. Whispers arose, faint like prayers, then louder like laments. There were many voices in different languages. Some I didn't even recognize, but they all carried the same weight: pain, fear, despair. My eyes drifted to the seats. The leather creaked, dipped, and rose on its own, as if invisible bodies were moving. The air grew colder, and thick steam rose from my mouth, even though we were in the middle of the desert. I reached out for one of the indentations, and for a moment I felt warmth, as if someone had been there seconds before. But there was no one. It was then that I realized these weren't just empty cars. This was a procession. The train was carrying passengers, Yes, but passengers who no longer breathe. With each seat, with each shadow reflected in the glass, I understood that the dead were traveling before me, silent, invisible, but present. When I reached the last car, I heard a dull knock on the wood, 3 slow, rhythmic blows, like nails being hammered into a coffin. My hand instinctively went to the handle of my revolver. The whispers suddenly stopped, and silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence of the desert. It was the silence from within the earth, the one that announces that something is about to come out. The train shuddered beneath my feet. The lights flickered all at once, and the windows were covered in a red haze. The final whistle echoed, louder, more desperate, like a scream from beyond. And it was there, in the heart of the ghost train, that I realized the truth. Red Hollow didn't just have graves that refused to hold their dead. Now it also had a trail that led lost souls, bringing them back whenever the moon decided it was time. The silence that followed was so profound that for a moment I thought I'd lost my hearing. But I soon realized it wasn't an absence of sound. It was a constructed, charged silence, as if designed to hide something. I took a deep breath, my hand firmly on the handle of my revolver, and pushed open the door that led to the next car. The hallway was narrow and suffocating. The wood creaked, as if alive, complaining with every step I took. The air was frigid, colder than the desert should allow. My eyes scanned the lined benches, each covered in marks that shouldn't have been there. Grooves in the leather, fresh impressions of invisible bodies. It was as if a crowd were sitting, but not a single pair of eyes were watching me. Then I heard, bit, at first, faintly, almost imperceptibly, whispers, broken words, interrupted sentences, voices coming from every direction. I quickened my pace, trying to make out one of them, but it was useless. The sound came from everywhere, from the benches, from the ceiling, from the fogged windows. The voices mingled in different languages. Some I recognized, others I'd never heard before. Some prayed, asking for salvation. Others lamented, weeping like abandoned children. But there was also laughter, quick, dry, sharp as knives. There were many, overlapping, as if all the dead of Red Hollow were there, speaking to me at once. I gritted my teeth and pressed on. The oil lamps hanging from the ceiling swayed on their own, even without wind. One of them flickered brightly, casting crooked shadows that moved as if breathing. The carriage windows were covered in a mist from the inside out, and in them I saw shapes, faces pressed against the glass, distorted like flesh submerged in water. Mouths open, eyes sunken, always staring at me. When I blinked, they were gone. My fingers itched on the revolver's grip. But what good is a gun against voices, against bodiless presences? The laughter returned, closer, as if someone had whispered in my ear. I whirled around, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway, the marks on the benches, and the weight, of invisible eyes. It was then that I realized something worse. The voices weren't just talking. They were calling to me. Sheriff. The sound pierced the air like a cold breath. Sheriff. And this time it wasn't one voice, but several, repeating at the same time, in different rhythms. Like a disjointed chorus, my heart raced, but my legs remained steady. I knew what this meant. Red Hollow wasn't content to leave the dead in the earth. Now, even the tracks were pathways for them to return, and the train was merely a vehicle for their doom. I ran my hand over my chest, touching the star I still carried. The metal was cold as buried ice. With each whisper, I understood more. They weren't just calling, they were inviting. They wanted me to sit among them. They wanted me to be a passenger. The train car ended, but not the silence. When I reached the next door, the voices all ceased at once, as if they had never existed. But the air still vibrated, as if the wood held the echoes. The feeling of having walked among invisible passengers stayed with me until the last step. It was then that I understood it wasn't just an empty train. It was a procession carrying not only the dead, but also those yet to be called. And in that moment, I realized something I'd never dared admit aloud. One of the voices echoing inside was my own. The door creaked like a scream as I pushed it open. The last car awaited me, and I already knew I wouldn't find anything in common. Be inside. My eyes, accustomed to the darkness, first saw the floor. Scratch marks, long grooves, as if desperate nails had tried to dig a way out. The wood was stained, not with paint, but with something that looked burned, etched by force. I approached, blew, and saw words, scratched haphazardly, as if many people had tried to write at once. But one phrase kept repeating itself, in crooked, almost illegible letters. Red Hollow will be everyone's destination. The air was heavier there, thick as invisible smoke. My palms were sweating, but I continued. The silence wasn't empty. It was a silence that waited, that watched. Then I heard the 3 knocks again, slow, spaced out, like hammer blows on a coffin. My spine froze. The same sounds I'd heard in open graves now echoed inside a train that shouldn't exist. I looked around and noticed handprints on the walls of the car, hundreds of them, as if trying to escape. Large hands, small hands, some from children. The boards were warped, as if they had been pushed from the inside out. The feeling was clear. This car didn't carry ordinary cargo or passengers. It was made to imprison. Suddenly, the car shook. The ground vibrated beneath my feet. The lights went out, and for a moment I saw only the moon through the window. A chill ran through me as I realized the train was moving on its own. No starting whistle, no conductor, just the invisible gears of something that wanted to take me with it. I didn't think twice. I pushed open the door, ran down the corridor, and jumped out, feeling the dry crunch of sand beneath my boots. I rolled on the ground, and when I looked up, the train was already gliding away. No smoke, no sound of wheels, just the immense shadow of cars receding into the distance, disappearing into the horizon. I stood there, my heart pounding, as the truth dawned on me. This wasn't an incoming train, nor an outgoing one. It was a procession of souls, an omen that Reed Hollow didn't just hold the dead in its cemetery, it also held tracks that carried curses. Silence reigned over the station again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't emptiness, nor was it relief. It was heavy, suffocating, as if every speck of dust had absorbed the whispers I'd heard inside the train. I stood there, chest heaving, watching the desert swallow the shadow of the locomotive as it disappeared, pinned to the horizon, leaving no trace on the tracks. No wheel tracks, no smoke, nothing. Just the memory of the whistle still vibrating inside my skull. I put my hand to the star on my chest. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been, as if it had spent the night buried among the dead. I knew, in that instant, that the train hadn't come to pick up ordinary passengers. It had stopped in Red Hollow for another reason. To remind me that not even the sheriff is exempt from the final journey. The words engraved on the floor of that last car echoed in my mind. Red Hollow will be everyone's destination. Maybe it was just a threat left by those who left. Maybe it was a promise. As I walked back to the city, with the sickly moon still illuminating my path, I realized something else. The train hadn't left empty. It carried with it not only the voices of the dead, but also a part of me. And now I ask you, if I were you, would you have stayed in that car until the end, or would you have jumped like me?